Tonight, we have a special guest speaker. In the past, we've shied away a little bit from getting deeply involved in electoral politics. It's just not the focus of what we do. But this speaker ties into many of the themes that we have talked about, specifically the need to challenge the Democratic Party establishment. Like many of the topics we have covered, this is a Colorado race, but the theory and tactics behind it appeal across the country in blue states and red states. One of the things we've talked about is, running for office, and that's a way that you can make a big change. And she's doing that. Karen Breslin is challenging an incumbent senator to fight for us against the rigged system, both in the party and in Washington, D.C. She's a lawyer and political science professor. And even though the opposition may seem overwhelming, Karen is an example of how we can fight the establishment both here in Colorado and in DC. And electing her will be one step towards building back better. So, with that, Karen, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me today. I really do appreciate it. And Candace, I just popped on but heard your story, and I'm so sorry about what you've been through. These are truly dark times, but we find light when we come together, and that really is how we're going to get through. So thank you for that. I would like to just share a few words about myself, and then I'd like to spend most of the time that you've allotted me to take questions and hear from you all. I really appreciate the work of your organization and that you're out there fighting the good fight because too many people aren't, as we all know. And so that you bringing the spirit of resistance to this moment is extremely important. And I say that as a fellow traveler, I hope, but also as an American who just really values our our system of government and do not want Donald Trump to destroy it. So as Morgan said, I am a political science professor. I've had an emphasis on American government for something like 30 years. Before I got into higher ed, I was a journalist and I covered Congress and the executive branch. But my interest in politics goes back beyond that. I'm a lot older than I would guess almost everybody on this call. But my political involvement goes back to the 70s when I was in high school. Jimmy Carter brought me into the Democratic Party because he stood for decency and standing for ordinary people and human rights, et cetera. And so I became a bit involved in the Democratic Party and vowed kind of right then and there that I was going to make a life out of political change, that I was going to find out how to fix things, right? In that youthful exuberance that we have. And so that led me to journalism because journalists were changing the world, and Vietnam War and Watergate and so on. Journalism played a big role in that as well as activism. And I ended up reporting from Washington for about a year, and from Colorado, covering really the nuts and bolts of the federal government. So I know federal policy. I know how the federal government works. I could not get out of DC quick enough, though. I could stand it for a year, and then I fled. And I came back to Colorado and got a job with the National Park Service. And that was just a $7 an hour job just to make ends meet kind of thing. But I worked my way up and did many more things over the course of my 25-year career there. And I left that agency as a senior policy advisor. So I know quite a bit about the environment and public lands. My teaching career has focused on Congress, on the American government, on American law, and environmental issues. That's really been the stuff that I've paid attention to. This is well, I guess I should also add that I became a lawyer, and I did that about almost 20 years ago, I guess, and have been trying to support public interest causes, Columbus Day protesters, right to rest, homeless organization efforts. All of those kinds of things have been in my realm in one form or fashion or another. I've done a bit of animal rights work. I've done rights of nature work. So I'm familiar with what it means to try to create political change outside the political system. And so if I've spent an entire lifetime really of trying to create political change outside the political system, why am I in it now? And the answer is that I came to the conclusion that the only way that we can have lasting, durable political change, my kitty's climbing around here, sorry about that, is to really change the political process. We have Donald Trump because we have a political system that's rigged, as Morgan said. We have a political process. I saw it firsthand as a reporter covering Congress, where the special interests take hold. They take hold of the candidates, they take hold of the members, and they take hold of the committee and the whole legislative process, and they get out of it what they put in money, mostly. And so, as an ordinary person, if you get off the bus and tour bus and you want to see what your Congress is doing, you won't recognize what they're doing because it's all so special interest driven. We've ended up with a political system that sends the lion's share of the productivity gains and wealth to to the top, very tippy top, as well as the top 20%, and largest corporations, wealthiest people, and the rest of us struggle. And we all know what that means. And when in a democracy, a quote democracy that doesn't serve everybody isn't a democracy anymore. We all know that too. And so how do we make this thing work better? And it has to be that the rest of us bring our presence to bear on the political process, even when it feels like a David and Goliath struggle, which it does right now. And it does for me personally as a Senate candidate running against John Hickenlooper, who's been a political fixture for about 20 years in Colorado. And he's got mountains of money. But I'm not going to let that stop me because I have people power behind me. I have people who care about the environment, who care about what happens to Native peoples, who care about racial justice, who care about freedom of speech and academic freedom, who care about what's happening to immigrants. Those are the people in my corner. Who cares about what happened in what is happening in Gaza? And standing against the Democrats who just rubber stamp policy after policy that's bad for working people, bad for human rights, bad for economic fairness. And so it is a difficult struggle, but I say to you as a political science professor, as a person who's studied social change movements over, the course of at least modern history in particular, I believe it can be done, and I believe it must be done. Otherwise, we're in for a very difficult and dark time, even as we're beginning to experience now. And so the only way to stop fascism is to reclaim our power as Americans. That's it. That's the only way. And I count as Americans anybody who's here. You're here, you're an American in my book. So, all of that to say that this is a struggle of enormous significance, as you all know. And I believe that we can come together and really put a challenge to the establishment wing of the Democratic Party. They want to see John Hickenlooper skate to the nomination and skate his way back into DC. Just yesterday, a Senate Agriculture or Senate committee, the Agriculture Committee, voted on Hickenlooper's Fix Our Forests Act. Fix Our Forests Act is more like Fell Our Forests Act. It's a bill that will expand logging and reduce environmental reviews. Major organizations, Sierra Club, Center for Biological Diversity, Wilderness Society, have all come out against this bill. And John Hickenlooper is cheerleading the fact that it got out of committee yesterday. Even Michael Bennet, who can hardly find the spine to stand up about most things, did not vote in favor of that bill when it was in his committee yesterday. So we get those people out of office. Job one. Somebody asked me at a meeting, who owns you? And I said, my horses, because that's the truth of the matter. The only entities in my life that matter are my family, my friends, my animals. That's it. I don't take money from APAC. I don't take corporate money. I'll never take corporate money. And you can see how fired up I am about that. Because if I start to do those kinds of things, then I'm just repeating or reinforcing the system that has screwed us all over. And I refuse to do that. So with that, I'd love your questions. Let me say one more thing. If you are supportive of what you're hearing from me tonight, I do need your help. I need your help to show up and help me get on the ballot across John Hickenlooper and anything else that you can do to heighten the visibility of the campaign. And I would love your questions.
So we've got a question in the chat. Let me find it. A lot of Dems did not vote for the big disgusting bill, but they still lost to Republicans. What will you do as a Dem to get both sides to vote on stuff that people actually want? Most people were against the bill.
Well, the Democrats don't have numerical power right now, but they still have a voice. They still have the capacity to control the public dialogue, right? Or at least contribute to it in a significant way. They don't carry water for the issues that matter. They don't go out there and really force, a dialogue around these issues, such as Medicare for all, something I personally support. Against the abuses that Trump has inflicted on all of us, particularly the immigrant community. Like they are silent about some of the most pressing issues. And I think this is because they are co-opted by corporate money. So what would I do different? I'd fight that battle. I would take that moral struggle outside of the Capitol and to the American people. And I would find like-minded senators who will do the same. There are senators who are consistently sponsoring and supporting really progressive legislation. But the establishment Democrats, the corporate Democrats don't, and they won't push for it. So let's push for it. Let's break up the largest corporations. Let's break up the monopolies. Let's have a fair tax policy that doesn't let the wealthiest get off while the rest of us carry the burden. And so, long answer or short answer, maybe in some, fight that battle. Fight that battle in the court of public opinion. Remind people what's at stake, because that's really the other thing that they need to be doing is not just showing up under the dome, showing up in the streets, showing up in town halls, mobilizing people, meeting with groups like yours, mobilizing people to put pressure on the Republicans. And, can I guarantee that that will work? I can't guarantee anything. Nobody can. But Republicans right now don't feel any pressure to do anything but what they're doing, or very little pressure. And so somehow that's got to change. They need to be confronted. And that's what's missing right now. And that's what I would be attempting to do.
So this
Thanks,
isn't.
Karen. I have oh, go ahead, Morgan.
I was just going to say, this isn't exactly a question, but somebody put in the chat, I won't vote for another politician that isn't with us in the streets. And just so you know, I was there with Karen on Saturday at No Kings. She was there, and she's with us.
I think the
And
only
someone brought up
I think the only event that I've missed has been the John Lewis event. It was after work one night and I was not able to attend, but I believe I've attended everything else. And mostly we've had a tabling presence at these events. I think we've only not had a table maybe once. But yeah, we've been tabling, handing out literature, doing what we can. I've asked a few times the various organizers to get the opportunity to speak, but that hasn't yet come to pass. But yeah, I'm there. And when there were protests against Columbus Day, um, twice, I mean, more than twice, but the times when I was an attorney, I attended as an attendee to some of them. But as an attorney, one of the first things I did out of law school was join with a group of lawyers who were defending people who had been arrested in these anti-Columbus Day protests. And I was fortunate to have beginner's luck and get charges dropped against about 280 people. I represented with a group of lawyers demonstrators at the Democratic National Convention in 2008 when Obama was nominated. And, I have the groups that I've worked with and offered my legal skills to are people who are trying to disrupt the status quo. Fighting for rights of nature in court, that's a disruption of the status quo. It's a very difficult thing to do. Fighting for animal rights, very difficult thing to do, and using law that is really treats animals and the natural world as just, objects. And so I think I've now forgotten what the question was. But, yeah. Um, that you wouldn't support anybody who wasn't in the streets, yeah. So I have made, I've done what I can to try to support activist groups and activist movements, and that's been important to me. But I've also had to work, full time as a professor in my job at the Park Service too. So it's not something I've been able to devote my full professional life to, but I've devoted a decent amount of time to it. Yeah.
We have
there's
another.
another question that kind of goes along with that. If you're elected, how will your experience in being a lawyer help further the rights of minorities?
If I'm elected, well, I can give you one example off the top of my head. So right now, and this has been going on for literal decades, but programs that are directed toward Native nations, and they're literally called Indian programs. So Indian Health, Indian Education Programs, that's their literal title. Those programs are underfunded as compared to programs that benefit non-Native people. And that's been going on a long time. And so the schools are unsafe and the healthcare is not what it should be because there's this funding disparity. Um, as a lawyer, that raises questions for me about whether the US has met its obligations under the I'm getting tired. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that declaration doesn't have the force of law in the way like a treaty would, but the United States has nevertheless pledged to uphold it. So that's a conversation that I could bring into Congress and into a conversation about why those programs aren't fully funded. The same would be true around treaties. The United States has pledged in some measure to recognize Native rights, then why are you not recognizing the treaties? Similarly, when developments such as the Standing Rock, the Dakota Pipeline on the Standing Rock Reservation, when projects like that are being pushed on Native peoples, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples gives them the right to push back. Now, is it enough of a right? No. But when the US government does not uphold those commitments that it made under the declaration, that is something that as a lawyer I can bring to the mix. Um, I'm trying to think of other things off the top of my head. Um, the way immigration law works, I did just a little bit of immigration law, enough to be scared of it, honestly, because it's just a mountain of paperwork. But but immigration law really does deprive people of the kind of due process protections that we would get in other contexts. And so that should be changed. I had a client who was removed in spite of the fact that I put on a really powerful case for him, like testimony and everything in an administrative court, which doesn't happen that often. And so there was nothing on the record really to rebut our contention that if my client was returned to his home country, that he would face political persecution. Regardless, the judge sided against me. And what that meant then was I'm thinking to myself, okay, how do I appeal this? Well, it turns out the Congress wrote a statute that makes it very, 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 very difficult to appeal a decision like that. Having been through that experience, that's something I would want to change. And so those are a couple of examples that come to mind.
All right. We still have a bunch of questions coming in for you. So um, I think the next one I have in line is as a Senate, there are many citizens who are perceiving the Democrats as not being strong enough in dealing with the shutdown in the ACA. What would you do?
Well, they aren't strong enough. And it's not so much that, I mean, I think they've done a decent job of drawing a line in the sand, but it's a classic opportunity to point at all of the ways that the Trump administration is detrimental, not just on the healthcare premiums. And so the brutality of ICE is something that should be on the table in this conversation. Because the truth is, at some point, they're going to reach an agreement about something. And this fight is going to be lost to some extent. I'm almost certain that that's what's going to happen. As a federal employee, I was a part of these shutdowns, indirectly, and saw how things played out in Washington as well as a reporter. The way that they're going to get out of this is the Democrats will give a little and the Republicans will give a little, and something will happen. That's likely to be the case. That's how most of these have played themselves out. Sometimes it takes longer, sometimes it takes less time. But what's been missed in the interim when they finally cut a deal on the premiums is this opportunity to draw attention to all of the ways that Trump has undermined our system of government and really brutalized people. Let's be clear about that. And so in this moment, this is a prime moment to put a stake in the ground about the ways that Trump has been chipping away at the foundations of our system of government. And that includes First Amendment rights. That includes due process. That includes the restrictions on his power. He does not have the power to shut off money that Congress has authorized. He just doesn't. And yet he's done that. And so for the Democrats to pick this one issue, important though it is, and not expand the conversation beyond that, to me is improper because it's like we're willing to go down on this, but you want to line the streets with troops, that's fine. We won't say anything about that. You want to, brutalize immigrants? Well, we're not going to say anything about that as part of this shutdown. And, again, the issue won't be whether you win or lose on all of these things because you're not going to win. That's the nature of this particular beast. You're going to win some victories, maybe, or partial victories. But it's a heck of an opportunity to message around everything that, is so wrong in our country right now. All of the things that brought us out for No King's Day.
Right. I like that answer. The next question is, how will you get federal funds to Denver, not just for the general fund, but for stuff like RTD's Access on Demand? This just had a price hike, which will be devastating for people on SSDI who are already threatened to lose their Social Security if the Republicans can, and no other income. And they could have used federal funds if available so that that didn't happen.
I don't know the specific mechanisms of funding for that particular program. So there's two pieces to the funding question in Congress. There's the authorization and the appropriation piece. And so if the authorization has been made, in other words, law has been passed to allow money to be spent in the way that's described here in this question, then the next question is, has it been appropriated? And that's left to the members of the Appropriations Committee. And that goes into a budget bill like that nasty thing they passed a couple of months ago or whatever it's been now. And so there again, one of the ways to kind of fight is I would be shocked if Denver's the only city in this trouble. And so join up, find other senators who are concerned about it, get to the appropriation committee members, publicize the issue, particularly as it affects, low income and potentially other marginalized groups, and really draw attention to it. Because if you don't sit on the appropriations committee or you don't sit on the authorizing committee, you don't have any direct role, but you can certainly raise the alarms. And I would try to be on as many relevant, on there's a limit on how many you can be on, but I would try to be on the appropriate committees that would be useful for our state.
Great. That's awesome. If you were in the Senate today, what tactics would you be using to bring down this regime, even pass a budget that doesn't give away the store?
Well, I'm not opposed to civil disobedience when and if it becomes necessary. Because if members of the US Senate won't engage in civil disobedience for this cause, then what right do we as senators have to expect others to carry that burden? And it's been really disappointing to watch so many senators kind of stay quiet about the severe circumstances that we all find ourselves in. So, whether what that looks like is going to be dependent on what the circumstances are, but, whether it's some kind of a silent protest, whether it's some kind of a disruptive kind of, tactic of some sort that's nonviolent, of course, but nevertheless, anything that's not authorized within rules or under the law, you're likely to face either expulsion and or um, arrest. So those are the kinds of things. I mean, that's on the upper end of the scale, and those are the kinds of things that I would certainly consider doing if we find ourselves in this situation when I'm a U.S. senator. On the lesser end, um, I would be looking to lesser in terms of the intensity or the sort of disruptive quality of it, I guess, or unconventional quality is maybe the word I'm looking for. I would be I would be looking to form a coalition within the Senate of other senators who have stood up. So Chris Murphy is one example. He took to the Senate floor, he outlined in chapter and verse the specific things that Donald Trump has done that have violated the US Constitution and US law more generally. Okay, what if you found, I think there's at least 15 of them, but let's say you've found 15 US senators who are willing to really talk openly and bluntly about this particular moment that our democracy is being chipped away at. You get that 15 together and you develop a strategy of going out all over the country. As Bernie's done his across the country tours, do the same thing around this. Do it in your home state, do it around the country, media strategy to go along with that, that sort of thing. And then within the chamber, anything that you can do to kind of muck up the works, like if you can take to the floor and talk for quite a long time, filibustering as is appropriate and useful, any of those kinds of procedural delays, those are the kinds of things that I would be interested in doing as well.
Excellent. In your opinion, how can we get super PACs and big money out of politics?
Um, that's an excellent question. Well, let's see. This is one I've thought about a lot, but it just doesn't have a super simple answer off the tip of my tongue. I think you all know that we're kind of stuck with this because of a pair of Supreme Court decisions. One that declared that speech was um, uh, purchasing speech, communicating with money, buying ads is protected under the First Amendment as freedom of speech. So money is speech is kind of the way to think about that. So if you try to restrict the money that somebody can spend on speech, you're pretty much restricted from doing that under one case. The other case is a similar idea, except it applies to corporations, these kind of dark money groups that you all hear about. So we've got these two Supreme Court cases. Now, I'm sure there's ongoing legal strategies to try to get those cases overturned, but whether that's going to happen in any kind of a reasonable time frame, I would not guess that it would. So what could you do instead? Well, a group was talking to me last week about, really pursuing amending the Constitution. I think that's not a bad idea. I think the other thing that could happen is pressuring the parties to restrict how much money can be spent on a campaign and to restrict the size of the donations. You can go below federal law. You just can't make. Um, Here's what I'm trying to say. You can make state law more restrictive. You can't just make you. You just can't make it less restrictive than federal law. So right now, the cap on individual contributions is, I think, 3,500. So set it to be less in Colorado. And I think you could get away with that. I'd have to think about that a little more, but I think you might be able to. But even if you couldn't do it under state law, you could certainly do it as a party. Whereas, the Democrats could say, if you want to run as a Democrat, you only get to accept contributions of, $200 or less. If you want to run as a Democrat, you can only expend X amount of money. Now, nobody wants to do that because of the arms race of money, right? So if the Democrats did it and the Republicans didn't, then there would be a clear disadvantage. However, if the Democrats would take that fight to the people and put pressure on both parties, Democrats don't do it until there's real political pressure to change, then you could maybe level the playing field out. So, constitutional amendment might be necessary, can't be done through legislation in Congress, to the best of my knowledge. Um, and what could you do through a party apparatus to try to control the spending?
Right. Somebody from Canyon City, um, rural red community, attendance doubled from the first No Kings, just like it did where we are, from 254 people to 550. And this question may be a little better for Tiffany and I, but Dems in that area are disorganized or seem to be disorganized. How would you build structure?
I don't think it's an organizational problem myself, and I don't really come out of the Democratic Party. I didn't become a Democrat until 2022 when I ran against Michael Bennet. So, and that was why I became a Democrat, was to run against Michael Bennet. So I can't really speak to the sort of internal organization of the Democratic, except what I've learned as a candidate over, because this is my third and almost certainly my last run. Um, so I can't really say that it's a disorganization. It's more like a tug of war, and it's not even really a tug of war. It's more like a David and Goliath kind of struggle, where there's a core group of progressive, change-oriented, anti-status quo Democrats within the state and somewhat active within the party, up against another group of Democrats who are more tightly connected to the most important political figures, who are not particularly change oriented and not particularly progressive. So Michael Bennet, John Hickenlooper, Jared Polis being examples of that. Every member, I believe, of the Colorado congressional delegation took money from AIPAC. And this is why both Bennett and Hickenlooper, at least it's one explanation for why Bennett and Hickenlooper kept supporting sending arms to Israel in spite of the genocide that has gone on there. So we've got members of Congress who have a lot of AIPAC money in their background, and and then there's other people who don't think that that's appropriate, and that's sort of me. So I don't think it's, and others, not just me. So I don't think it's a disorganization. I think it's kind of a fight, and you're seeing that fight play out nationally in the Mamdani race and in the situation in Maine with Plattner and Janet Mills. So the real question of this particular moment is whether leftist progressive politics take root in the Democratic Party and kind of shift it from this kind of centrist politics that it's been doing for literal decades, or whether they pull back the control and marginalize leftist ideas and progressive policies. And that, of course, is what happened to Bernie Sanders. So it remains to be seen, I guess. Stay tuned. But I'm doing my part to push the party in a progressive and left oriented direction.
Okay. Um, I think you've answered this a little bit, but it says also, where were the other members at No Kings? Very few were there. Frankly, in light of the shutdown, why are them still drawing a paycheck when other federal workers and the military are starting to hemorrhage? Would you be a senator who would accept a paycheck during a shutdown?
No, I wouldn't. But I don't know what that looks like. It probably looks like just donating it or something, because I don't know what the mechanism is for how it's funded and whether you could, just like stop it from coming to you. But no, I wouldn't, because I agree that's not appropriate at all.
Okay. What would you do to keep ICE out of Colorado?
Well, one question that's been sloshing around in my mind is, how did ICE get authority outside of the border? Um, so could whatever it's authorizing legislation be modified to take that authority away? And I think that's maybe an angle to look at. When federal and state law conflict, especially around something like immigration, federal law is going to prevail. But where are the areas where state law could, like in Chicago, they've been trying to designate these zones where ICE can't go. That would be more something that would be in Phil Weiser or Michael Bennett's domain if when one or the other of them becomes governor. But as a senator, I'm not able to do anything that's just Colorado specific. Um, and the other thing to bear in mind is it's a little bit surprising even, but most senators only get a handful of bills passed over the course of their career, if that. Like we're talking three or four is not uncommon for a 6-year term. And sometimes often those bills are fairly inconsequential. So a big policy change is something that is going to have to work its way up through the legislative process. But having a cadre of legislators who want to really see a change like that, because as far as I can tell, ICE's brutality in our communities is is unprecedented. Like I don't remember, maybe I just was not aware of how abusive they were before all of this happened, but this is an exceptional expansion of ICE's jurisdiction and power, and that could probably be undone in a couple of ways, changing the authorizing legislation and or changing the appropriation. And of course, as you all know, the budget bill that just got passed explodes their budget, and that needs to be brought back. So I would be actively lobbying against giving so much money to ICE. I would be actively asserting that I should not be in essence, Trump's personal police force. And I would be insisting that they be unmasked. I would be insisting that they not be, weaponized like they're in some kind of war zone. I would be insisting that the tactics that they've unrolled, in Chicago of rappelling into buildings and massively sweeping people up, like that has to be stopped. But I think using your voice as a US senator is probably going to be quicker in terms of mobilizing public participation than necessarily trying it through the legislative route. But I would do everything that I could. I mean, quite honestly, that's that is very important stop. It's just, it's not okay that our communities are being terrorized in this way.
Okay. Somebody said, I love your thoughts, but Hicks' strength, and they're not a supporter, is that he brings independence to the voting booth. How are you going to walk the line of being left and still appeal to moderate right and independence? We need them to beat Hickenlooper.
Well, um, I think that I think that this is a solidly left state in a whole bunch of ways. And, the support for Bernie Sanders is part of it. Across 2 elections, he did really, really well. Um, so I think that there is untapped progressive sentiment in this state. And I think that Hickenlooper kind of rose to power when the state was more conservative. And so he becomes governor, he becomes mayor, and then he becomes governor. And as governor, he really governed like a moderate Republican, very pro business, very corporate oriented. He sued communities that were trying to control fracking. That was an issue that I had some involvement with as a lawyer. Um, Not those cases per se, but assisting a lawyer who was involved with those cases. And, that's kind of a big thing to try to control the sort of uses that a local community has to deal with. He's very pro corporate. He believes in public private partnership. And I don't believe in that. I think that corporations have had too much control and government has done too much to serve their interests. So I don't think that that's a message that is going to just appeal to our people. I think, our people being people on the left, I think it will appeal to a lot of independents. And so I don't think I necessarily have to water down my messaging to appeal to people who would otherwise vote for Hickenlooper. Because the people who are going to vote for Hickenlooper of that sort, they're going to vote for a Democrat, I think. But um, anybody who's a MAGA Republican is not going to vote for Hickenlooper either. So there's more unaffiliateds in this state than either Democrats or Republicans, if my memory serves. And we go after them by what's called the kitchen table issues. And Democrats and Republicans both are responsible for how difficult it is to get by. On Wednesday, I had to take out a loan on my home equity to kind of level myself out financially. And there's lots of stuff, homeowners insurance is going up and property taxes, and we all know the stuff that's making lives difficult for people. And so those are the issues that I would really be focusing on, as well as reclaiming our government out of Donald Trump's fascist hands.
I will add to that that she is running in the primary against Hickenlooper. If she wins that primary, and she can do that by appealing to the left, the general election in Colorado is going to be a very different type of race than it would be in someplace like Kansas or Nebraska, where needing to appeal to the center and right are going to be far more important.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
really good point because I think it was Colorado Newsline sort of tracked where Colorado was in terms of ideology, and then Bennett and Hickenlooper. And we're here and they're over here to the right. It's kind of surprising.
all right, so the next question is, how about saving elections?
Saving elections.
And I
Um,
think this goes towards the mid decade gerrymandering and the ways Dominion is being bought by a right wing company, and how are you going to keep the integrity of our elections, or how would you?
Whew, um, hmm, that is a very difficult question because so much of it is left to the states in terms of drawing the boundaries and all of those sorts of things. Um, I'll have to. I don't have a great answer for that. I will have to give that some further thought. I mean, as a U.S. senator, you can always draw attention to the things that are going wrong. And so, if there's a reason to be questioning the integrity of the election process, that's something that I would be screaming from the rooftops about. But in terms of being able to stop it or change it, That's something I would have to understand more in terms of what's Congress's authority over that and what, laws might be available to um, put things back. What I know about election law tells me that it would not be the easiest thing to do, and it would probably take litigation. And it would have to probably be something like equal protection challenges, where a vote in one community that's not been corrupted counts, but a vote over here in a community that was corrupted in some way doesn't. Well, that would be an equal protection challenge. You go to court, so on and so forth. But I think that we are in good hands in Colorado from everything that anyone tells me. We have a very solid election system. Jenna Griswold has done a great job with that. And so I think we're in good shape here. Nationwide, I would just be a watchdog and try to figure out what to do if that changes. And it could. I mean, that's something that I think we're all wondering about right now.
So let me also say I appreciate you taking the questions that aren't directly related to something a senator can do. I really appreciate you going ahead and answering those as well. Um, but to go along with that, how do you feel about creating term limits? And it was broadly stated, but people also specifically talked about the Supreme Court and in Congress.
I support term limits for Congress. It would take a constitutional amendment, but I think it's a good idea. I have pledged to be a one-term senator. Some people have urged me to back away from that pledge, but I don't think that that's a good idea, and I'm not inclined to do that. So, because for all the reasons that, term limits are useful, it gets, no one has their hooks in me, right? If you run for one term and you're done, nobody's got their hooks in you while you're there. You don't have to take phone calls you don't want to take from some donor who wants you to do a particular thing because you don't have to run for reelection again. You just get to serve the people of Colorado to the best of your ability, and that's the end of it. And maybe they all ought to serve for 6 years. Now, the way Congress works, there is lots to be said for having some seniority and longevity in the institution in terms of the power that you have. It's less important on the Senate side by a long ways. It's much more important on the House side. But be that as it may, if everybody's new, then the power is going to get distributed in different ways, and it's not going to be so dependent on seniority. So I do think that that might be an important way of getting the corporate, and special interest clutches out of our members of Congress. And what was the other question? Was there
Uh,
another one?
no, just
That was okay.
well about the Supreme Court. Would
Oh, the
you
Supreme Court.
term
I
limits for the Supreme
am
Court?
I'm not opposed to that. I'd have to think about it a little bit more. Um, but I don't at first blush hate the idea. It too would take a constitutional amendment. I mean, the Supreme Court was intended to be a body that was above the political fray so that they could hand down decisions that the majority would not like. That was what it was designed to do. And that is how we get decisions that have uphold the rights of minorities in spite of what the majority sentiment might have been. It hasn't always served that function well, but I would want to think about whether term limits would alter that mechanism because that really is the mechanism that prevents us, for example, from being thrown in jail for lighting a flag up. The majority of Americans don't want flag burning. But the Supreme Court doesn't have to care about what the majority of Americans think because they're not up for election. And so the Supreme Court can say, you know what, that's a symbolic expression that's political, and it's exactly the kind of thing that the First Amendment was intended to protect. And so once you put political pressure on the Supreme Court to appease the majority, then it can no longer function as the shield for all of us to protect our individual rights. And so on freedom of religion, for example, you don't need freedom of religion if you're in the majority because the majority is never going to silence your Christianity. But if you're outside that majority, watch out. And similarly, so Colorado had Amendment 2, the Anti-Gay Rights Amendment from all the way back in 1992. And the majority of Coloradans went to the polls and directly voted to deprive LGBT people, T was not included, of their civil rights. And the Supreme Court, being an unelected body, told the majority of Coloradans, you know what? You don't get to do that. That's a violation of the US Constitution. And so I'm mindful of of that mechanism and how important it is, and what does it take to maintain that? Because that's really the only thing standing between us and tyranny is a body that will protect our rights. And the Supreme Court is not doing a good job right now on that, at least relative to Trump. Although they did stand for due process a couple of times now, I think. Yeah, sorry. My answers are
That's
too
all
long.
right.
Sorry. I need
Um,
to soundbite them better.
there is a new coalition in Colorado that Solidarity Warriors has signed on to called No Concentration Camps in Colorado. What would you do to keep concentration camps out of our state?
Well, there again, it turns out that the Biden administration actually proposed this. Did you all probably knew that, right? Um, so I think that Trump maybe expanded the number, but Biden actually initiated this, if my memory is accurate. And if I'm not, you guys correct me, please. So what that means then is whatever the motive was of the Biden administration, presumably not as vicious as Trump's, although that might be a false presumption, but presumably, then we have to figure out, okay, well, what was the mechanism that all of that got approved through? Was it part of an appropriations? And I know the expansion of the facilities came through the big budget bill. How can you stop it? And here again, once it's become law, which it has, then how do you stop the federal government from spending money that Congress has authorized? And, you know, all you can do is put a lot of political pressure on the state to try to stand firm against allowing those to happen. I went down to the Hudson facility and did a short video, and it got a decent amount of traction on TikTok. I don't know, close to 10,000, I think, 8 or 9,000, somewhere in that vicinity. Because it's an issue that really resonates for people. Like, no, we don't want to be. I mean, incarceration generally is a bad thing, period, just, straight up. Sometimes it's necessary, but to expand it for this purpose, it strikes a lot of people as wrong, and I'm certainly in that category. So figure out what you can do lawfully to try to block it, then figure out what you can do in terms of public persuasion to try to block it, then figure out what the state can do and support the state's efforts to block it. And there was something else I was thinking about that. Well, I don't know what it was. I forgot.
That's all right. The next question is, Karen, what were you before you became a Democrat?
I was unaffiliated. So the Democratic Party left me behind when Bill Clinton was elected, and he moved the party very much in the centrist direction, and I was not on board with that. That's really when the Democratic Party became what it is today, and and Bernie Sanders convinced me to get back into this. And some of it is because I'm 64 now, and so I've spent literal decades of my life trying to figure out how to leave this world better than I found it. And I've tried using the law, only to watch pretty much everything we tried to do legally around rights of nature and animal rights be really pretty significantly stymied, because the courts don't want to be on the cutting edge of legal change because they aren't elected. Or I'm sorry, political change, because they are unelected and they feel like it's beyond their purview to kind of strike out in a bold direction. And that's not an entirely wrong position for them to take because federal court judges are not elected. But then that puts you right back into our political process, electing people to Congress, electing the president. And so that's really when, so I struggled with the law. I struggled with journalism. By the time I was through my journalism career, the journalism industry had pretty much collapsed, and it became much more consolidated. It became much more corporate focused. Investigative journalism was on the decline, the kind of muckraking sort of things that had happened in the 50s and 60s and so on, that a lot of that's gone. So all that to say that I come back to the Democratic Party because I come to the reluctant conclusion that if we're going to have lasting change in this society, we've got to grab the levers of power.
Great. I'm going to start paraphrasing some of the longer questions because we're starting to get a little low on time. Um, Somebody said that their health care and health insurance is going to be changing, and they are in Garfield County, that their UHC Advantage is no longer going to be in network, and the Mayo Clinic has stopped taking it all together. They're going to have to switch to traditional Medicare. What can you do to change how health insurance works in Colorado?
Um, well, that's probably more of a question for Phil Weiser because that's more specific to having some kind of law that at the state that sort of fills in the gaps between the coverage you had versus the coverage you need. And I'm a little bit in that situation myself in the sense that I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to manage that. I'll be Medicaid eligible next year, or I'm sorry, Medicare eligible next year. But I think the answer is Medicare for all and, full comprehensive coverage for everyone. Because as I understand it, looking at it, Medicare does a reasonably good job with, hospitalization and some bigger things like that. But you've still got this gap of what happens when you need to go to the doctor, and that is what those Medicare gap plans are for. And that, and there's actually an entire it's a little documentary. I think it's My Perfect Union or Our Perfect Union. I don't know if anybody's ever followed their documentaries, but they're short, but they kind of dig into issues like this. And some of these Medicare policies, these supplemental policies, can be problematic. So, as a U.S. senator, I would be pushing for Medicare for all. If you can't do that, then let's push for some kind of a tax credit for people who got those supplemental policies and now can't get them in their state. And then they can get a tax credit that can cover purchasing it at a higher rate, or create an entire program that complements the ACA and allows coverage that way. This is something that would require more in-depth study on my part to know exactly what the right answer is. But at the end of the day, people should not be left without coverage. And Medicare, unfortunately, still does leave people without coverage.
I think the short answer is Medicare for all, and that fixes it.
Yeah, like full robust Medicare for all. Yeah, exactly. Not partial Medicare for all.
And again, distilling a large question down to something a little shorter, um, what can be done about the housing crisis?
Break up private equity companies. That'd be the first thing that I would do. Control how much of the market can be controlled by any particular housing, any particular construction um, company, and the companies that are buying up individual homes and apartment complexes and really controlling the market that way, and then outlaw the use of algorithms for rent setting, which, as far as I can tell, is just price fixing. That would be one step in the right direction. Then we could do something like, and there's already bills been introduced that Hickenlooper does not support, that would give people a credit, a tax credit for rent. So you pay a certain amount in rent, you get a certain amount back. You could also do a deduction that whatever you pay in your rent, you get a percentage or even the entirety of it, depending on the cost of it, and deduct that from your taxes, and that gives you tax relief, and that would help, pardon me, offset the cost of housing. I am not convinced that the issue is so much the amount of housing. That's kind of what we're told a lot. I think the issue is more the affordability of it, that the housing seems to be constructed with, um, larger properties, larger prices is what I'm trying to say. um, More expensive homes. And, because out where I live, where they're building like crazy, there are no houses under $600,000 that I can see. Well, who can afford that now, particularly with interest rates as high as they are? So, more starter homes. And one of the ways that you could do that is change the tax code so that a corporation, a home builder, pays more when they build housing that we don't really need as a society, kind of penalize that, and they pay less when they build what we need. And you could do the incentives for home purchasers too. Okay, you buy a 1,200 square foot house, government's going to give you a nice little rebate of, I don't know, we'll pick a number, $5,000. I can buy you, some kind of little goodie in your house. But you go for the 3,500 square foot house, no goodie, no benefit, right? So using tax policy to sort of hit the supply side and the demand side to try to encourage behavior in a certain way. And this is why we have mortgage interest deduction, as they wanted to encourage home building, they wanted to encourage home ownership. We should be doing the same by creating opportunities for people who are in the rental market to actually break into home ownership. And we need to break up the consolidation of control by the home builders and the private equity companies and the other investment companies.
So somebody asked, what can we do to stop private equity altogether? That I think follows up, but I think you answered that pretty well. It would be the same idea, right?
Well, Elizabeth Warren, who endorsed Hickenlooper, actually has a bill that is pretty good. I don't necessarily think it's strong enough, but it kind of would adjust their business model because right now they don't use their own money to buy up companies. They, as far as I can tell, strip the assets, kind of, drain them dry, and then the companies go belly up, and then, they make out like bandits, and people lose their jobs and communities are devastated. Penalize those policies. Don't allow that to happen. Require them to have a certain amount of investment in whatever it is that they're purchasing. That was in Elizabeth Warren's bill. Some transparency would be good. I think there are things that could be done to control that particular business model. And the way it seems to work right now is most of the incentives are for them to concentrate, and scoop up more industries and more of the market. Everything from like take something like food. I don't know what the number is, but a surprising number of food companies, restaurant type companies, like Dunkin' Donuts and Jimmy John's, and I don't know if those are the exact two. I'm pretty sure Dunkin'. No, it is. I'm almost certain they're all owned by one company, right? So they're different brands, but it's one company. The same with hotels. The same with car rentals. All right, let's not allow that. Let's allow like actual competition instead of one. So we're deceived into thinking we've got competition. We don't have competition, right? You want to go rent a car, you've got like basically two companies to pick from, but however many brands. And don't quote me on that because I don't, but you get the idea, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So let's break all that up. And if that requires altering the existing antitrust laws, then let's do that. But it's absurd because the market control is out of control, and we need to be we as consumers, we're just like we're extremely vulnerable. I'll just put it that way.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. So this is going to be last call for questions, and I'll run through what we've got, and then go from there. The next question is, would you be willing to vote for changing the rules regarding cloture and making it only require a simple majority or use the nuclear option? The Dems were almost able to pass voting rights bill in 2022, but Manchin and Sinema voted against it. Should the Democrats regain control of Congress, would you be willing to push for using the nuclear option to effectively end the filibuster?
No, and I think it's a pretty dangerous idea. Um, and I'll try to explain why. So when I was a reporter covering Congress, there was two or three really bad anti-environmental provisions that were in the energy bill that I was covering at the time. One was to open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling. I think the other one might have involved expanding drilling off coastal areas. I don't remember the third one, but it was to make nuclear plant licensing easier. And the threat of filibuster resulted in those provisions being either modified significantly or taken out entirely. And one, if not two, senators from Colorado actually filibustered the Arctic drilling provision, and that resulted in that provision being taken out. The filibuster is the only thing standing between us and the worst excesses of the Trump administration. It is the only thing. They have the majority. And the way that they got the budget bill through was because they didn't have to deal with the filibuster. The reason that the shutdown occurred is because they did have to deal with the filibuster. And so getting rid of the one tool that allows the minority to kind of slow up an abusive agenda of the majority that door is going to swing both ways. And it has already. And in this respect, as I understand it, during the Obama administration, the Democrats supported removing the filibuster on federal judicial nominees. And when Republicans gained power, they said, you know what, that's a great idea. Let's do it for the Supreme Court also. I'm almost certain that had the filibuster been in place when Trump's nominees were up for a vote, that those individuals would not have made it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would look different than it does today. So I personally wake up every day thankful that the filibuster in its current form is still alive, and it may die over this budget situation, which would be a pretty bad thing. And it's why both parties have been reluctant. But as far as I know, it was the Democrats who first sort of um, blew up the nuclear weapon. And so, do I want to see more of that? I do not. I pray that we get the filibuster back in an expanded form, because we probably would not have the Supreme Court we have right now. We would likely have reproductive rights again, and Trump would probably be getting put in his place more consistently than he is right now.
Okay. Um, Similarly, do you believe in a soft secession?
No. Yeah, I can answer that pretty firmly as well. No, I don't. I think that I believe united we stand. I very much believe that we have to remain a country. I believe that the reason we are in this moment is because this political system has stopped serving the needs of the majority of Americans. For me, American history is on a spectrum of not very democratic and more democratic, and that's a fight always toward more democratic. And we've made substantial advances over the course of our history to improve the level of representative government that we've had here, and who counts, reducing the number of marginalized people or the ways in which they're marginalized. And that expansion has, of course, slipped the other direction. And I kind of point the finger at people like Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton for that to some extent. And so if we want to reinvigorate our democracy, we have to stand together. Otherwise, I mean, the national security implications of that are off the charts too. Like, I think we're ripe for the plucking, of a foreign adversary if this country breaks apart. And I'm sure I'm not alone in having family members. My father and my grandfather fought in World War II. And, we're going to break apart because of Donald Trump and MAGA? Not on my watch, anyway. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Fantastic. What do you think about the Colorado Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR?
The reason I'm running for federal office is I am not super knowledgeable about state issues, but I know that TABOR very much restricts and interferes with being able to properly fund programs, and that it needs to be modified. That is what I understand about it, but that's about as far as I can go with that conversation. So.
Fair enough. We've got three more questions left. What would be top on your list for Project 2026? Stepping in when there's the void as the house of cards fall down, refunding what first, the catastrophic data breach, Department of Education, reestablishing medical insurance availability. What would be your first priority?
So let me make sure I understand the premise of the question, that we've gotten Donald Trump out of power and we're now back in power. Is that the premise?
I think it's more, if you were going to write a Project 2025 for the left, what would you put in?
Pretty much everything that I've talked about now. So I think if you break up corporate power, and that you can do through the law, you don't have to wait for a Supreme Court decision to do it. If we can get solid majorities of Americans willing to do that, and I can't imagine that they wouldn't be willing to do that when you understand why it's important, and we sell that case. I think that's a huge step in the right direction to getting a government back that represents ordinary Americans. It's hard for us to believe in our particular moment, but there was once a war on poverty under the LBJ administration, that even under a Republican administration, significant environmental laws were passed. And we have been in such a period of retrenchment where we don't think big, we don't dream big, we don't expect anything big. That's because our political system has become so tightly wound up with corporate interests. We got to pull that apart. So that would be job one, is getting them back in line, breaking them up, controlling their power, controlling their influence over the legislative process. Then job two for me, and the two are related, would be healthcare. Let's have a single payer, comprehensive healthcare program, Medicare for all, for everyone in the country. And that will go a long way toward having people believe in this system again. Healthcare costs are the number one reason that people go bankrupt in this country. And we all spend a ton of time and energy on paperwork and all of that crap. I mean, you can't even make sense of it all. It's so not. I tried to understand the various Medicare Advantage plans and all that crap, and covers this and it covers that and whatever. I'm a lawyer and I couldn't, I was about ready to throw up my hands. I'm used to complicated, tedious stuff. And it was too much for me. Like, no, it's ridiculous that we have the system that we have. So that would be step two. That would be very high. Step three would be, and these would be sort of on parallel tracks for me, really thinking about environmental protection, climate change, dealing with that in a robust way. A carbon tax, more public lands protections, more protection for ecosystems, because ecosystems can help with the carbon problem, absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere. A carbon tax can help us get our climate policies in line with reducing carbon emissions. And then I would be really wanting to tackle the racial justice piece. And that looks like immigration, a prompt path to citizenship, treating people with dignity and humanity and respecting their human rights. It looks like a truth and reconciliation kind of commission where we really confront the racism that is embedded in American history and American law, and really have a robust and meaningful conversation around that produces meaningful policies. And I already have, there's plenty of people who've already got policies on these things, but dealing with the problem of mass incarceration, dealing with the racial income gap, those are things that need to happen as well. So that's my wish list. If we could start mobilizing around those kinds of things, I think we could go a long distance toward making the future brighter and better than it is today.
Great. What actions do you recommend to encourage people to bring down the regime? There's talk of a national strike. Do you feel this would send a stronger message? Perhaps one in which the Democrats, in a show of solidarity, would do a walkout.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not the activist that I suspect many of you are. It's not that I wouldn't like to be, it's just something that I don't have any expertise in. So, so I'm not the right person to ask. But I am pretty aware of the way that activism affects policy and law. And so what I teach my students is that when you try to create political change, you've got to think about it at the social level and at the legal level. And the social level includes changing what people on the ground actually think about things, which is the work that you folks are engaged in, really trying to shift people's perceptions about whatever it is that you're advocating, you're trying to persuade around. And so would a general strike really be a meaningful way of persuasion? Yes, I think it could be. But I would personally, before I said, yes, let's do this, I would want to know a lot more about what it looks like. Because we also don't want to give Donald Trump an opportunity to, enact full-scale martial law. And that, and could it look like that? Could it go in that direction? So I just would like to have more information before I personally said what needed to happen. But yes, I mean, if all of the groups that are thinking about this, and there's a coalition of people, organizations that say yes, this is what needs to happen. As a U.S. senator, I would absolutely stand in solidarity.
Great. And then, do you believe utility companies have monopolies in Colorado If so, do you plan to break up those monopolies?
Utilities, utilities are a horse of a different color. And so they're legal monopolies, and I believe that that's a function of state law, not federal law, but I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. Um, and
That
I
that's a
also
perfectly reasonable answer.
yeah, and thank you for that. And I'm also not 100% sure that the public utility model isn't a good one for some things because it gives regulators some control if they exercise it. So price hikes, for example, have to go before the Public Utility Commission. And if it truly represents the interests of the people, then you want that kind of a check on corporate power. So utilities for some things might not be a bad idea. Generally, I'm opposed to monopolies, but if you regulate the hell out of that monopoly, then maybe that's an appropriate for a particular kind of industry like utilities. That might be an appropriate thing to do. But I truly don't know enough about how they're actually structured, other than I do think it maybe is a function of state law. Now you can see why I'm not running for state office.
All right, this just came in, but I think it's an important question that speaks to you a little bit more. What laws would you write to stop future abuse of power the way we're seeing this administration do?
Well, the problem with trying to use law to stop Trump or anybody like him is that he is indifferent to the law. So the laws are already there. That's kind of not the problem. I don't know off the top of my head that any new law is necessary. What I think is so shocking and for me personally pretty heartbreaking is the way that Democrats and other institutions of our society, and the Republicans, the two major parties plus universities plus the American Bar Association, and you can go through a laundry list of societal institutions that ought to be holding him accountable, and too often they're bending the knee for his power and giving in. And so I don't think that a legal change is really what's going to be necessary. He has no authority to spend money, to not spend money that Congress has appropriated. And he has very little authority to spend money as he chooses. And so that was never in question. He has very limited authority to just wipe out, the federal workforce. He has almost no authority, it depending on the agency, but for the most part, he has no authority to eliminate an agency. So legally, it's really clear. He can't do a lot of the things that he's been doing. But the problem with going to court to stop him is that it is a time intensive process, where they make their nonsense arguments about why they get to, and then the other side says, Your Honor, those are nonsense arguments. And for the most part, courts are agreeing. And then it gets up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, Well, you haven't really done all of the litigation yet. So while it's still in flux, you go ahead, Donald, and you go lay off all those workers and you go ahead and round people up and we'll sort it out at the end. Well, you can't sort it out at the end, right? So, all that to say, here again, this is why so much of this fight is with folks like you and those of us who are at No Kings. And, all the people who are speaking up in podcasts and community groups forming and all of the, sort of grassroots energy around trying to put that SOB back in his box. And that's where my personal frustration with the Democratic Party is. Like, they should be shouting from the rooftops every single day in a coordinated way about why. Most Americans don't know that. They think, oh, he's president. He must be able to kill the Department of Education if he wants to. Why not? He wants to lay off a bunch of people. Well, my boss can lay off people. I'm sure Donald Trump must be able to. No, that's not how our system works. Sorry, got a little fired up there.
We love it. That's okay. Um, so that is the last question. The last thing I'm going to do is put the link to your website in the chat. If people are interested in getting involved either in Colorado or outside of Colorado, what can they do and where can they go?
Go to our website, breslinforcolorado.com. Thank you, Morgan. I put it in there too earlier on, but it's good to have it in there again. And we need donations of cash, even small amounts. Share information with anyone you know. And like if 10 of you share with 10 people and everybody gives $10, that's going to add up. So that's really the thing. I mean, just today I was spoken to sternly by various people about how I have to raise a lot more money. So you're hearing me say, you're my proof that I am giving that message. But it is not an easy thing to do, as you all can well understand, right? Because he is a sitting U.S. senator, and people think he's got a D behind his name. He's better than a Republican, and I will say only by a little bit. But he's not what we need in this moment. So cash donations, getting the word out. And then if you're in Colorado, please um, consider supporting our campaign, because the way I get on the ballot is through the caucus and assembly process. And we need folks to show up for that. It's not complicated, but it's another type of activism that really is important for really breaking open the kind of special interest money grip that these organizations have on our political parties. So thank you.
Yeah, there is a question. What is the maximum donation that is allowed to you?
3,500 is the amount.
Okay. So,
And I could tell you I've seen that exactly once. But if you're John Hickenlooper, like I think our average donation is $20 or something. But if you're John Hickenlooper, man, you got no shortage of those big fat donations. So anyway.
well, I think you'll be seeing more. But thank you tonight, and thank you for coming. Is there any closing statement you want to make?
No, thank you all for all that you're doing. I mean, No Kings was amazing seeing that many people. We're going to win. I believe deep down in my heart that we are going to win, because we're already fighting so incredibly hard, even with the weak leadership that we have on the so-called opposition party. So we just keep going and we just keep going. Right. And thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it, and for your amazing questions and for the moderation. Morgan, thank you so much for that. And yeah, that's me.
Thanks for
You're
being
welcome.
here tonight, Sharon.
Oh, thank you for having me, Tiffany. I appreciate it. All right. Well, I am going to wave goodnight. Bye,
Good
everyone.
All right.
night.